Normally, I kick off each of these episodes with a quote, something profound or something vaguely impressive from someone famous. But for this episode, it just didn't feel right. Today, I'm speaking with Professor Alison Phipps about the psychology of sexual violence. It's a serious and it's a difficult subject, and frankly, Alison scares me a bit. Not personally, but intellectually. Her knowledge of this area is vast, and mine isn't. Now, I'm a behavioural psychologist, and I work with organisations, and I help their customers or their patients change their behaviour for the better. I never deal with individuals, and I certainly not anyone who has experienced violence, sexual or otherwise. I'm simply not qualified to do so. So you might be thinking, why on earth did he want to record this episode? Well, there's three reasons, really. Firstly, while I'm not an expert, I am curious, and I hope you are too. Secondly, this podcast has always been about the idea that psychology is everywhere. Even in the darkest corners of our society, there are patterns, there are behaviours, and there are systems we can attempt to understand. And thirdly, I've known Alison since we were teenagers. Back then, she was far less intimidating and used to make me mixtapes which featured what she would call a healthy amount of Prince songs. Now she's a revered academic, a fierce activist, and the author of books like Me Not You, which I've read with a mix of admiration and anger. So I'm personally very interested in what happened in between the mixtapes and the activism. So this episode isn't going to be a formal lecture or an academic interrogation. It's more like two old schoolmates having a pina colada and catching up. And yes, we will be talking about serious things, but we'll also laugh, and that's okay. Humour, when used with care, can be part of how we deal with heavy topics. Ultimately, I hope this episode gives Alison space to speak in a way she maybe hasn't had before, and that no matter where you are in your understanding of this issue, you'll come away with something to think about, and maybe even to talk about with somebody else. How does that sound to you, Al?
Very good.
Super, super. So I'm going to introduce you formally now. Professor Alison Phipps has spent over 2 decades working in the movement against sexual violence. She is Professor of Sociology at Newcastle University. She co-authored the National Union of Students report, wrote Me Not You, and her upcoming book, Sexual Violence in Racial Capitalism, is out in early 2026. Now, the Alison I know loves Prince, sang in a close harmony vocal trio, and competed with me in university to see who could send a letter to each other in the most outrageous package possible. And it's fair to say that Alison won when the porter of my building handed me a box of Tampax with my name on it. Do you remember that?
I do.
I remember I sent you on an Angel Whip packet.
Oh, that's right. Angel Delight.
Angel Delight,
yeah.
That's right. And the powder was still in the packet as well. So my idea was when you opened it up, the powder went everywhere. I can't remember if it did or not.
It did.
Yeah. So I think out of everyone I know and grew up with, and this is no insult to other people that I know who hopefully listen to this, your life has gone on a journey from teenagers together dancing to Shaggy in the local pub disco in Portishead to becoming a world-renowned academic of gender studies. How did that happen?
Yeah, what happened? Well, I was going to be a ballet dancer, as you know.
I do.
Yes, so I...
Because you left school at 15, was it?
16, yeah.
16 and went to Elmhurst Ballet School.
I did, yeah. So I
and
left
I stayed
school.
on at the school to do sixth form. Yeah.
That's right. I left school after GCSEs and went to do full-time training in ballet and other forms of dancing. And I did that for 3 years and did my A-levels there. So I wanted to be a ballet dancer. I wanted to join a company. I wasn't good enough for that. I wasn't strong enough for that. And I didn't want to go and kind of seek work as a jobbing dancer. It's very insecure, 18, 19-year-old working around the world. I mean, some of my friends did it very bravely and had an amazing time, but I didn't have the confidence to do that at the time. So I went to university instead, and I went to Manchester and studied politics and modern history just because I'd liked history at A-level, and that's where I found feminism.
And when you say you found feminism, I guess Manchester's a wonderful city, a diverse city, both in sexual equality and diversity in other areas as well. Was it the academic side which introduced feminism to you, or was it the social side, or a mix of two?
Yeah, it was kind of a mix. So I had this amazing lecturer called Ursula Vogel who taught feminism and introduced me to all kinds of different books. At the time, it was mostly kind of the 1970s white feminist thinkers, Germaine Greer, Kate Millett, those kind of people. But those books blew my mind at the time because I'd been raised quite traditionally gendered. So Germaine Greer is kind of not really somebody I would engage with now because she's gone a bit mad, especially in terms of saying very transphobic things in her later work. But The Female Eunuch, I have to say, was a book that sort of changed my life. And it was all about femininity and how femininity is almost a form of castration because it sort of saps the energy, it saps what you would call maybe in psychology the more aggressive side of the personality, and that aggressive side, that angry side is where a lot of our life skills are, where a lot of our skills to cope with things, where a lot of our resources are. And that really rang true for me when I read that book. So it was kind of reading things like that and also being in Manchester. And as you said, Manchester is a very diverse city. It's got a very active gay scene, so exploring those sides of myself as well, meeting people from different backgrounds who have different ideas about the world, all of it really came together. So I got very much into feminist literature and feminist issues at that time.
I think I'm going to come back probably later to your story again and how it may have influenced your life and your work, obviously. But one thing we haven't talked about yet is really your work. We started to touch on it there. You mentioned, femininity is constructed and even that femininity is a form of castration. And I think the people listening might be going, okay, this is a bit heavy. We're going into the heavy side now. So let's do that. And I think the book, Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism is, I'm going to be totally honest with you now, is the first one I read of yours. I do have Women in Engineering. It's behind me on the shelf.
Don't read that. It's really dull.
But yeah, I just never got into that one. But Me Not You, one, it's a smaller book. So, straight away, psychologically, that's easy. I can read through this. But the message in it is a big message. And it surprised me because when I first picked it up, I was worried, I suppose, that I was about to be delivered a treatise on why middle-aged white men were the devil incarnate. Now, I'm not saying as a whole that they're not sort of a vile subgenre of the human race. But being one myself, I have a certain level of mental self-defense which kicks in. However, in the book, you take a certain stance, I suppose, against feminism in a certain way and suggest that mainstream feminism is dominated by white privileged women. Can you sort of summarise your argument in terms that I might understand?
Yeah. So, I guess I should probably say something about where the argument came from. I have been studying sexual violence for a lot of years, as I've said, and I started out in that kind of white feminist canon. So a lot of our theories about sexual violence do come from 1970s and 1980s white feminism. Partly because these are the women who were working in universities at the time. So it was hard for non-white women to get academic jobs. It was hard for them, when they got academic jobs, to be taken seriously. So a lot of the theory from that time is by white feminists. So I had read all of that theory and absorbed it and had used it to inform my work for quite a long time. And that theory tends to be based on either ideas about men being inherently violent because of their biology. So sometimes it's very crude in that it's genetically encoded. Sometimes it's more nuanced than that in that, it's to do with differences in bodies. So there's a very famous book called Against Our Will by Susan Brown Miller, where she argues basically that because men have a penis and women have a vagina, so because men can penetrate women's bodies, they did. So the earliest rape was done because it could be in order to enact domination over women. And that started a whole system in which men dominate women through sexual violence. And then other theories of that ilk kind of tend to take a similar sort of view that masculinity is violent and femininity is submissive, and that is not necessarily genetic, but that it's so socially and psychologically ingrained that it now is kind of like second nature.
Yeah. It's almost not questioned.
It's almost not questioned.
At least not until recently anyway, yeah.
Exactly. And there's a lot of truth in that. You know, there is definitely an equation between masculinity and violence. You know, if you look at wars, you know, if you look at violence, these things are, you know, overwhelmingly done by men. If you think about what makes a man extremely masculine, then physical power and perhaps the ability to commit physical violence might be part of it. But I think that those theories are quite limited in that they only look at gender. So they kind of theorize a group called men and a group called women. They are opposites, if you like. They have sex with each other, and sexual violence is perpetrated by one group on the other.
Upon the other.
On the other, yeah, exactly. So that's one weakness of those theories, because actually the groups, men and women, are, in the current day, these groups are kind of very diverse groups, you know, so men in one society might be very unlike men in another society. You don't just have straight men, you have gay men, you have bisexual men, you have all kinds of things in between. You know, we have trans people, we have non-binary people, etc., etc. Race is a massive social factor that impacts on how gender is understood. So black women are viewed in very different ways to how white women are. If you look at something like the Williams sisters, Venus and Serena Williams in tennis, you know, the way those women have been treated throughout their careers is very different to how white women would be treated.
Yeah.
They're treated as being more masculine, and they're treated as being more aggressive. The angry black woman, you know, that's something that is a trope because of how race and gender intersect. So the theories are limited from that perspective, certainly. Also, there isn't really a lot of evidentiary basis for the idea that gender kind of emerges all at once, and that gender emerges as this system where men dominate women everywhere at the same time. So there's quite a lot of evidence that even as recently I say, but even as recently as the early Neolithic period.
Oh, that recent.
Yeah. There wasn't really the same gender differentials that we might expect to have today. So
what do you mean?
Well, the fact that women have children, the fact that women get pregnant and have babies, or that we call people with those types of bodies women, has not always meant the same things in societies in history, but also between different cultures. So reproductive bodies have not always been dominated and controlled by people that we might now call men. So those theories are quite kind of one-dimensional, I guess. And also what they tend to do is to define all men as the same and all women as the same. All men are inherently violent. All women are inherently vulnerable. And the answer to the problem of sexual violence is normally, within these theories, for the state to intervene and for us to arrest people and lock them up. So prisons and police are the answer to protecting women. And I guess this is a long-winded kind of way of me explaining that the book kind of emerged out of the Me Too movement intersecting with Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
So Me Too starts in 2017. The recent iteration of it starts in 2017 with Alyssa Milano tweeting. Black Lives Matter, the kind of recent iteration of that, starts in 2016. And then obviously in 2020, it kind of ramps up another level with the murder of George Floyd. And I think at the time, I was really struck by the fact that there were all these white feminists saying Black Lives Matter, while at the same time saying, oh, we should arrest people for rape, we should have more prisons, we should have more police on the streets, longer sentences, make more crimes. And we already know that the prison system disproportionately targets Black people, people of colour, people who are marginalised for different reasons.
But isn't it okay to hold those views in general? Or are you thinking that people haven't really thought about the complexities of what they're saying?
Yeah, I guess I was quite struck by the inconsistency of it and the ease of being able to say Black Lives Matter, you know, and it became a slogan, didn't it? And it was, you know, the black squares and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it became quite easy to jump on that bandwagon without actually thinking about the implications of what it was you were saying. And the Black Lives Matter movement is very much about prisons and policing and the way in which Black people, other people of colour, other sort of marginalised people are made disposable, really, in capitalist systems. So if you're not able to be employed, if you're not able to be contributing to the economy as a consumer, if you are homeless, if you are an immigrant, if you're claiming benefits, you know, all of these types of people tend to be seen as problems that need to be dealt with. And one of the ways in which we deal with them in the current context is through policing and through prisons. So we literally put people away.
Which is inherently biased against people of race. And
absolutely.
Therefore, you've got Black Lives Matter on one side.
Yeah.
On the other side, you've got people who we should ramp up the police side of things to protect women. But by doing that in a inherently biased system, you're going against your first idea of Black Lives Matter.
Exactly. And something like more police on the streets, some white women would probably find that that made them feel safer. But many women of colour would probably not find that that made them feel safer.
So you're not saying that the Me Too movement was wrong, or are you?
No, not at all. I mean, I think it was limited. I think that there was something very powerful about all of these, mostly women, but not just women, people of other genders as well, being able to say, yes, I have experienced this. But I think it was limited in terms of, well, what happens next? So after all of this disclosure, what happens afterwards? And the response tended to be kind of limited to naming and shaming individuals and having quite high profile criminal cases. And some of these powerful men were taken down and some of them weren't. But not really addressing the conditions in which, even for instance, what are the conditions in which a Harvey Weinstein is possible? And also the other responses tended to be kind of workplace policies and procedures, some of which might be useful, but some of which might be kind of very compliance focused. Sometimes even having a policy is a bit of a double-edged sword, because the fact that you've got the policy means that you don't do anything else. You know,
yes, you think you've solved it.
You think you've solved it, or you commission a report. So I think it was limited because it was a movement of mass disclosure, but it was a movement of kind of collected individual disclosures into a mass rather than a kind of collective action movement.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Of kind of, these are the things we want to change collectively. You know, but let's put our heads together and think about some of the bigger changes we want to do. And I think that's because of social media, right? Social media is a very communicative medium, but it's based on individual communications, a kind of ping pong of individual communications, you know, rather than, let's say, getting people in a room or on a Zoom meeting together and let's plan some actions as a collective.
So almost like, I mean, social media, like you say, is, well, lots of problems with it. But because it's a communication medium, you can use it very well to signal your virtue or your feelings.
Yes.
But nothing happens.
Exactly.
It's just a room of shouting people. And then they all leave that room at the end going, great, I've had my little shout. And the world hasn't changed.
Absolutely. And then it's almost like either the disclosure or the outrage, the shouting becomes an end in itself. You know?
Yes.
And then nothing else happens.
We've solved that, haven't we, by having a shout?
That. We've had a shout about it. Yeah, it's funny, you know, I don't do much social media these days. I only do LinkedIn. But LinkedIn at the moment is full of people shouting, as they rightly should be, about the genocide in Gaza. Yeah. As they rightly should be. You know, we should all be shouting about it all the time. But they're shouting about it whilst simultaneously claiming that they're the only person speaking out about it. It's almost like social media becomes, you know, not just an echo chamber for a group of people, but your own personal echo chamber where you kind of shout into the void and think that you're the only person doing that.
Is that because people may feel helpless in such a large situation as Gaza, that individually, what can you do?
Absolutely.
And the only weapon that some people have is their social media.
Absolutely.
And so how do we move, or how does, I guess, an individual move from that wanting to shout to taking action, or at least helping to bring action and help change to happen? I mean, how does that? That's a really hard thing to do, isn't it?
It's a really hard thing to do. I mean, I think with Gaza as well, it's not like we haven't tried other things. You know, I mean, people have tried so many things, writing to their MPs, going out on the streets, donating money. You know, people have tried so many different things. You know, this sense of helplessness in relation to Gaza, I think, is the worst I've ever felt, you know, in my adult life. So I'm not blaming people for shouting on social media, because sometimes it feels like that's all that's left. I think when it comes to things that are slightly, I don't mean smaller in their impact on individual people, but certainly smaller in their political magnitude, like sexual violence, I think we can move from social media to action. And I think social media can be really useful in bringing people together, but I do think it needs to be one of a number of strategies. I mean, I think in my work on sexual violence, I've really started to be of the opinion that it's often the local that is the most effective form of work. So I've done a lot of national policy work. So as you said, I worked with the National Union of Students on their study on lad culture in 2014. And we did a lot of good work there in terms of raising awareness. But if you're talking about how to either prevent sexual violence from happening or deal with it in a way that is more transformative than just punishing people, which doesn't work, then I think it's probably better to start small.
You mentioned something there which triggers something in my head, that you said punishment doesn't work. And I just want to hone in on that, because as a psychologist and as one who follows, I guess, a behaviouristic view, we tend to look at how the environment shapes people's behaviour, not how personal, individual attitudes, opinions or beliefs does.
Yes.
We have more success when we look at what's surrounding somebody and then changing those surroundings, and then that individual can change their behavior. And one of the things we know in psychology is that punishment doesn't work. You think as conditioning, and a lot of people think we can punish if a child, small child, does something, punish them, they won't do that again. It's a sort of Victorian attitude towards rearing children. Psychology is known for a long time that doesn't work. But that's why I'm sort of linking it across to some of the thinking in your book, because you make quite a strong case for the link between sexual violence and capitalism.
Yes.
And I think, this is an assumption, but I think many people think at an individual level, this man who did this bad thing to this woman is an individual monster.
Yes.
And therefore the punishment aspect becomes, we're solving the problem by getting rid of that monster out of the society. But you tend to think broader than that, don't you? And I tend to sort of, when I read it, made the parallels with that sort of shaping behaviour in the environment. Can you talk about that a little bit more, that sexual violence and the link with capitalism? Yeah,
absolutely. And you're right. I don't believe in monsters, really. I mean, I think probably some people can become monsters, in certain environments, but I don't believe anybody is born inherently violent or inherently bad. I don't believe men are inherently violent. And I do believe it is the conditions in which we are placed that create violence. I mean, capitalism being the economic system we're currently in, where we don't have a subsistence economy where we basically grow all our own food, make all our own clothes. We might trade a bit of something with somebody in the next village, but, essentially we can be self-sufficient. Capitalism is a system in which we sell our labour for money in order to buy stuff, and in which things are mass produced, and in which there are global relationships of trade and kind of creating value, creating products. I think capitalism is a system that encourages us all to be arseholes. So capitalism is...
That's my excuse, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's my excuse too. I mean, capitalism, in a very crude kind of Marxist sense, is a system that is based on exploitation. So the capitalist pays the worker to work, but don't pay the worker the full value of what they've produced. They cream off the surplus. That's what Marx called surplus value.
And not
And
only
that's
that,
how
every year they've got to make more capital out of that worker.
They do.
So either the worker has to get paid less, or
Yes.
you charge more, or you give people less for their money.
Exactly. And
Which
you
is why
constantly,
wagon wheels are no longer the size they used to be.
Quite, which is an absolute travesty.
It is.
Absolutely.
Now we're getting to the nub of the issue.
We are. We're
Yeah.
the really important stuff. Exactly. And capitalism, because of all that, has a kind of impetus to expand as well, you know, and from its very earliest days, capitalism was that kind of expansionary system. So colonialism wasn't an extension of capitalism. It was actually there from the very start as a condition for capitalism to develop. We had to kind of go and pillage, you know, various natural resources, forms of labour, land, etc., from the colonies in order to create capitalism. So capitalism is a system that encourages people to be arseholes. So the very system is not set up to encourage nice behaviour. And actually, capitalism, I would argue, is dependent on violence, or the threat of violence. Because if you want to exploit people, and especially if you want to exploit people really quite badly, which capitalism does in a lot of ways, then you have to be able to threaten them. You know, you have to be able to make them scared. And poverty, obviously, can be seen as a form of sort of structural violence. The fear of poverty is, you know, what pushes people to have to sell their labour in kind of increasingly degrading ways often. In order to survive. But also a lot of workplaces function on violence or the threat of violence. If you look at what happens in sweatshops, for example, you'll see a lot of workplace violence. If you look at the Amazon warehouse, you'll see a lot of workplace violence. And I guess what I'm arguing is that quite a bit of this violence is sexualized. And that's partly because capitalism depends on sort of power relations that are gendered. So capitalism needs human beings to be reproduced and maintained basically for free. So the capitalist system does not invest in the birth or the maintenance of the human population. The state is supposed to do that, but it doesn't really do that anymore either. But the capitalist system doesn't do that. It expects all of that to be done for free by somebody who lives in a private home, and that somebody is usually a woman. That's why we need gender, because we need a class of people who are seen as naturally fitted for that reproductive role. So capitalism relies on gender. Gender relies on sexual violence. So if you want to keep a class of people who produce new life in their bodies, if you want to keep them subservient, if you want them to work for free, you either have to kind of accept that women are naturally subservient, or there has to be somewhere role in this for violence. Masculinity and femininity are, you know, can be seen as roles of sort of dominance and submission that support that capitalist system.
I'm just going to take a pause to reflect on that, because I think that was a lot.
It was a lot
going into my little brain there, and I've scribbled lots on my pad in front of me. Is it like a snowball effect, do you think, that when that sort of thing starts to happen, and you know, for whatever reason, and we're talking Neolithic to up until now, that the gender of male took dominance through violence, sexual violence, aggression, and physicality, that they then start to protect that power that they've got. And therefore that submissiveness, making the gender of a reproductive body, women, the submissive one, becomes very important in order to keep the power. And that has snowballed and snowballed and snowballed all the way through history. Well, first of all, I'd probably put that as a question. Is what I said not right, but aligning with what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, we'll never know, you know. So the first chapter of the new book.
Yes, which I will definitely get onto in a minute. I've got questions about that.
Don't worry, it's fine. The first chapter is called An Anti-Origin Story.
Yeah.
Because we can't really know what the origins of gender or sexual violence are. But I go through kind of a lot of the information that we have, and I think it's plausible that, you know, gender does emerge when there's a need to dominate bodies that reproduce within kind of more organized forms of society. So, you know, we don't anymore think that there was a kind of big agricultural revolution in the Neolithic period. It was more kind of that agriculture emerged at different times in different places for different reasons. It was much more kind of haphazard than that. But we do see evidence that as agriculture starts to bed down, you do see gender differentiation emerging in things like burials and things like that, you know, and you see more evidence of people dying violent deaths. So you also see more violence in the record. And obviously it's more often men that died violent deaths through fighting, because as soon as you start agriculture, communities start hoarding surplus food, you know, they start producing more commodities, then you start to get stuff that other communities want to steal, you know, and then that's the other factor that I think that we would talk about is the role of weapons and warfare in the creation of masculinity and femininity, but also in the kind of growth of sexual violence as a strategy, really. So rape within war, you start to see a lot of evidence of that in the Bronze Age, you know, especially with the Roman Empire, but also these other Bronze Age empires and states as well. And I think that speaks to the fact that reproductive bodies were already being dominated, you know, for kind of economic and social reasons, and that sexual violence had become a very good strategy of kind of terrorizing a population, of laying ownership to particular types of bodies.
It's really complicated, isn't it?
Yes.
And I try not to sound dumb, but the connections between everything, and I think it goes back to what you were saying about the Me Too movement, that may have been well-intentioned by people, but they don't take time to see the connections with what they're saying.
Yes.
And we've got, you know, capitalism relies on gender, gender relies on sexual violence, gender identity is tied to all of that.
Yes, that's right.
You've got the idea that when you're talking about rape in war, for instance, in psychology, we've got the anonymity effect, that the more anonymous you feel, the more likely it is you're going to be violent and rude and insulting. And they did studies where they put people in a room which was just blacked out, so they didn't see anyone coming in or out, and they just left them in there to chat. And they did the same with the lights on for another group, and the people in the dark were much ruder, insulting, and actually it led to some violence that the scientists had to stop. It's just an experiment. So that feeling of anonymity means that we go into a part of ourselves maybe we don't do normally. And then you got the connection, once you think of that, to, well, okay, the police, and, would we all just go wild if there wasn't a police force? And it almost leads, that level of thinking leads back to the biology argument which you set at the beginning, that that inherently violent as part of biology, or maybe even part of evolution, which, as you say, is a very simplistic and incorrect way of thinking about it. But you can kind of see where people take this complicated ball of string, and then just try and find an argument, because if they can just blame it on biology or the monster men, if you're going on the individual side, that's that argument done. I can get back to watching Netflix again now.
Absolutely.
And it's hard. It sounds hard.
It is, and I don't think we are inherently violent. I think as a species, actually, we're inherently social.
Okay.
We're inherently communicative, we're inherently a pro-social species. And that's our strength. That's our great strength, and the development of language, obviously, is what has marked us out as a species from the development of complex, kind of conceptual language, especially, and arts and culture is kind of what marks us out. And none of that is related to violence. I don't think it is natural for human beings to want to dominate each other.
Yeah. It reminds me, here we go, our link to the animals. Closest cousin is probably the bonobo ape. And you won't find many TV documentaries on bonobos, because mostly they pick nits out of each other and masturbate each other.
Oh, okay. Well, fair enough.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Exactly. And and sexual violence does occur in the animal kingdom, but not that often, not as often as it occurs in the human species. So I guess going back to what you're saying about the behaviorist, paradigm, even though my argument is a sociology one, not a psychology one. It's kind of similar in that I'm saying, this system of capitalism is set up to make us violent. And not only that, it relies on violence. It relies on racialized violence as well. It relies on colonization. It relies on certain areas of the world being defined as inherently less developed than other areas of the world, which continue to exploit them. It relies on capitalism relies on difference, division, and hierarchy. And how do you impose difference, division, and hierarchy on people who don't necessarily want it? You use violence.
So what about non-capitalist countries which have a high rates of sexual violence against women? And I don't know, I read recently, China, North Korea, Taiwan have a very high increase in sexual violence against women, but they're not capitalist countries.
Well, they're not capitalist countries, but they are sort of capitalizing countries. I mean, North Korea maybe not, but certainly China and South Korea are very rapidly, and especially China, very rapidly industrializing and becoming a kind of market dominant country. The thing that you see a difference is between kind of highly organized societies, whether those are capitalist ones or somewhere like China, which is kind of a hybrid of various different things, and more kind of communitarian type decentralized societies. So in somewhere like pre-Columbian America, for example, there were very low rates of sexual violence. It did happen, but it was kind of rare enough that a lot of people writing about that period of history kind of define sexual violence as in some ways a European import, So colonization imported patriarchy and sexual violence into societies where there had been different forms of kind of gender and gender hierarchies, and certainly it wasn't rape free, but where it was quite a rare occurrence. And often in these societies, it was something that when it happened, it kind of put your masculinity in question rather than being the ultimate masculine thing to do.
Yeah, yeah.
So sexual dominance was not associated with kind of alpha masculinity in the same way as it would be in certainly in capitalist society.
I'm interested, I'm almost going to take an intellectual pause, and then we'll talk about your upcoming book a little more. Mm-hmm. But I know you as a very funny, very warm, caring person, and I like spending time with you. I don't think we do it enough, but we live quite far away from each other. How do you balance all the views that you have with living? I mean, where do you find joy, I suppose, amongst all of the complicated and it can be seen as negative things that are going on?
Yeah, I mean, I find, I wouldn't say joy, but I find a lot of satisfaction in feeling as though I'm working on something that is important and that is needed. But also, I mean, I find joy in lots of other things as well. My kids, my family, singing, dancing, all of the other aspects of life. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I do think, maybe I should just research something nice,
Yeah. And I imagine people who work in aid, people who work in areas of the world, which is very traumatic, or even military personnel who get sent to places and see things and experience things, they must have that doubt at some point to go, why didn't I just become a greengrocer?
Absolutely.
Or a fishmonger or something and just have that type of life.
Absolutely.
You've got to find that, like you say, that aspect of you that wants to feel like you're making progress, that you're competent and that you're helping the world in some way. Is that how you're feeling? Yeah,
no, definitely. I'm very driven in that way. I want to feel like by the end of my life, I want to feel like I made a difference. I want to feel like it mattered that I was here in whatever way. It doesn't have to be in any set way, but I just want to feel like, okay, it did matter that I'd lived. I mean, also, it's not that bad. I'm not, I'm on the front lines on the ground in Gaza. I'm not, working in the emergency room of a hospital. I'm not, I'm not working in a development program where people are living, on the very edge of sort of desperate circumstances. I live a very privileged life as an academic and I get to write about things I'm interested in. And I also get to talk to young people.
And that leads us on to then your second book, because it's coming out in early 2026.
Hopefully, yeah.
Does it follow on from Me, Not You?
Kind of. I mean, I think it follows on from Me, Not You in that Me, Not You was a kind of diagnosis of these are some of the things that I think are wrong with white feminism, or what you might call liberal feminism. And that doesn't mean, it's not about skin colour. It doesn't mean that all white women do this type of feminism and no non-white white women do it. It's more about its kind of roots. Yeah. So that was the diagnosis of this is what's wrong with that type of feminism. And one of the things that is wrong with that type of feminism is that it lacks a kind of an in-depth, nuanced, multi-dimensional theory of what sexual violence is and what it does. And I guess sexual violence in racial capitalism is my attempt to provide such a theory, which I hope will be helpful. And it comes out of, in a way, it comes out of work that I'd done with staff at rape crisis centres, a few rape crisis centres in England and Scotland, who were really keen to explore ways in which they could separate themselves a bit more from the criminal justice system. So it's really hard when you run a women's service or a rape crisis service, because a lot of your funding comes from the state, a lot of your funding comes from the police force, a lot of it carries that expectation that you will cooperate with the criminal legal system in order to receive that funding. So it's really hard for them to kind of divest. So I did a few workshops with staff from different rape crisis centres talking about, well, what are some of the ways that we could divest, or at least kind of try and shape our thinking in a slightly different direction. And one of the things that they were saying to me is that we're sick of all this 1970s theory that is all about, you know, men dominate women, men hate women. The answer to that is to have other men in policemen's uniforms to come and protect us, especially after the murder of Sarah Everard, which really kind of made the limitations of that framework quite clear. So I suppose sexual violence in racial capitalism is a bit of my answer to that, of, you know, here's a theory. Yep. It probably won't be right all the time. You know, some people will hate it. Yep. Some people will kind of think, oh, well, I like this bit, I don't like that bit. Hopefully, though, people will use it as a jumping off point to either expand on what I've done or to critique what I've done, and to just start a different conversation that's a bit more embedded in thinking about, you know, especially the economy at a deeper level, you know.
Is it a book anyone can read, or is it a book academics should read?
Well, it's quite academic, and it's quite academic because the ideas are quite complex, and I felt like I had to really go in and do all of that complex stuff first. I don't think I write in a very inaccessible way. So I think somebody who has an interest in the issues and has read around before would be able to read it and hopefully enjoy it.
Okay.
What I am planning to do, though, is to do other things. So whether that's a shorter, sort of more of a trade book, or whether that's podcasts, or whether that's short articles, or what have you, to try and make the ideas a bit more accessible to other people.
Well, let's try and do that now.
Okay.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Without being reductionist, you know, at the end of the day, can you sort of give the theory that you put forward in simplistic, almost bullet point terms for people?
Yeah, I think so. So my argument is that capitalism relies on sexual violence. And I call capitalism racial capitalism because capitalism, even from its inception, was reliant on colonization of other parts of the world to get those raw materials and that labor and slavery. And today it's still reliant on that idea of certain nations as underdeveloped, so they're where the sweatshops are, and you know, and we do all the important work, you know, in Europe and North America, etc. So capitalism is racial capitalism. It relies on sexual violence to, first of all, extract reproductive labor. So how do you reproduce the labor force? You have to have a class of people that do that work, and capitalism doesn't want to pay for it. So you have to get that for free. How do you get that for free? You define women as inferior. You define women as submissive. How do you get them to submit? Well, you do that through violence. One of the case studies in my book actually is based on Silvia Federici's work on the early modern witch hunts in Europe.
Oh, right, okay.
capitalism, at the same time as capitalism was developing, at the same time, the early modern witch hunts were happening, which were a mass campaign of kind of sexualized terror, mostly against women, often against women in positions of power across various European countries. And Federici argues that the witch hunts were kind of necessary for capitalism in order to suppress women so that we could have this reproductive labour force for capitalism.
Yeah, keep the snowball going.
Keep the snowball going. Yeah. So, it's not the first instance of this happening, but it's a big instance of this happening. Yeah. Because actually there's some evidence that medieval women had enjoyed a certain amount of power and influence, that needed to be suppressed.
And is that also true that if you say that is almost a false story being put out, false news being put out against women being witches and therefore scaring everyone else back into submission, that the same is true of black and people of race as dangerous,
yes,
or
absolutely,
as stupid, or as whatever it might be, to justify controlling them and violence towards them as well, I suppose.
Absolutely. So that's the other side of it. So I argue that racial capitalism is dependent on acts and threats of sexual violence. So not only the enactment of sexual violence, but also the threat of sexual violence is a big thing that keeps mostly women under control, but people of other genders as well. So, gender non-conforming people experience a lot of street harassment, for example. So acts and threats of sexual violence are a tool of social control, but also who we are taught to fear is part of the equation. And the idea of sexual threat in racial capitalism is very much racialized. So the sexual predator is often a man of colour or a black man. And you can see that. I mean, just yesterday I was reading, articles in the paper about how migrants are bringing rape with them into Britain, about sexual assault.
You just have to pick up a copy of the Daily Mail
you
to
do,
probably
exactly.
read a story very similar.
Muslim grooming gangs, for example, all of that stuff. So I sort of argue there's a pincer movement here. So let's take Donald Trump.
Oh, really?
Just for a minute.
I thought we'd get through one episode without mentioning him, but there we go.
Let's take Donald Trump, who has been accused of sexual assault, credibly accused by, I think, 20-odd women.
And sort of admitted it himself,
and sort of admitted it himself and sort of is quite proud of it in a way, who also is saying these Mexicans are coming in to rape our women. And that is a kind of microcosm of what racial capitalism does.
Yes.
So it relies on sexual violence, but it also relies on a definition of sexual threat that is used as a tool of racist oppression.
Yes, okay.
And I do kind of go a little bit psychoanalytic in this part of the book as well, in terms of the violence of racial capitalism, in terms of, colonization, slavery, witch hunting, whatever it is, being internalized in the system and then projected onto the racialized other.
Yes. Yeah.
And that is why in a lot of kind of colonial history and in slavery, you'll see that fear of revolution is fear of rape.
Yes.
So the idea of the black man as rapist is really the fear of the violence of racial capitalism returning to itself, in a way.
It almost comes down to that in-group, out-group mentality.
It does.
I can't remember the cave study and the blue eye, brown eye study in psychology.
Yes. Yeah.
Where you can very easily create in-groups, out-groups with something as simple as their eye colour.
Absolutely.
To the point that they actually are physically violent towards each other. And these are school children. I will put those links down in the show notes because I cannot remember the studies' names.
Absolutely.
It also reminds me of the Clark-Dull test as well. Kenneth and Mamie Clark were two psychologists, and in the 90s they got a series of children. I think they were sort of under 10. They must have been actually younger than that because they were given dolls. Mm-hmm. And they were identical dolls, apart from one of the dolls' skin colour was black and one of the dolls' skin colour was white. And then they asked them questions, basically what they thought of the two dolls, their perceptions of the two dolls. Mm-hmm. And the results were that the majority of black children who were asked preferred the white doll over the black doll.
Yeah.
And they gave them positive characteristics. So when they were asked who's pretty out of these two, they'll point at the white one. Who's clever? Point at the white one. Who's stupid? They point at the black one. And who's bad? Who's criminal? Who's dangerous? And so these stories have seeped through into children as young as 3, I think was the youngest there. And these were children of all different diverse backgrounds.
Yeah.
But it's in them as well to keep them submissive. I mean, I'm trying to think of a solution, and obviously I won't be able to think of one, because if I did, well, Nobel Prize would be knocking on my door. But is it possible for men, especially white men, to be part of the solution? Or are they always going to be part of a problem?
No, absolutely. Definitely. I think we're all part of the solution. I mean, I think part of the problem is that not enough people are doing this work, on any social issue. Most people would rather just keep their heads down and get on with their lives and survive as best they can, which I completely understand. It's hard. Modern life is hard. But because not enough people are doing the work, the few people that are doing the work get overloaded, get frustrated, bang their head against brick walls and can't make a change, because actually we need a collective, a collective change. But absolutely, and men have to be part of the solution. I mean, what would have happened if the first time Harvey Weinstein sexually harassed somebody, she'd approached somebody about it, and they told somebody else, and maybe a group of men in the industry had got together and said to Weinstein, look, mate, you've got to knock this off. You've got to knock this off, otherwise we're not going to work with you. So absolutely, men have to be part of the solution. Yeah. Do
you see your books as being positive?
Positive in what way? Like optimistic?
Yeah, let's say that.
I'm not sure. I've been told they're not.
Okay.
I mean, I don't
you're pointing out a lot of problems.
Yes.
But pointing out a lot of problems with the ambition to change, it must be positive.
Yeah, and I think I really resist giving answers, because I do think the impulse to look to somebody for the answer is part of the problem, because I think, solving this does require all of us to put our heads together and solve it, rather than looking to, somebody to lead us out of the quagmire. I mean, obviously there's an issue with so-called charismatic leaders in more general terms politically. And I think that the kind of tendency to ask some people, what do we do? What do we do? I think that is a big part of the problem. I think actually if we all sat down together, or we sat down in our communities or our schools or our workplaces and kind of, okay, let's hash this out. Let's see if we can do something a little bit different about this. I think that would go a long way towards solving it. But I don't see my new book, especially Sexual Violence in Racial Capitalism, a big part of my argument is that violence is necessary because power is never complete. Because if everybody was completely under the thumb, you wouldn't need violence.
Okay, yeah, it would go away at that point. Almost like 1984.
Exactly. So, that to me is a very hopeful perspective to take. And I think that informing ourselves about these issues, trying to think a little bit more deeply about it, and then talking it through with people around us and thinking, well, maybe we'll just do this a bit differently, is the way that things are going to change.
I think that's a nice place to end. It's sort of a nice positive end to it. And there's not a lot of psychology in this episode. I think we should change it to everything sociology.
Yeah.
We could start a whole new podcast, everything sociology. You can have that one.
Yeah.
But I'm interested, I think, for a lot of people who have listened, maybe heard things that they hadn't thought about before, or maybe had thought about but is a different viewpoint, and maybe somebody who hasn't ever read feminist theory, never studied politics or power, but wants to understand more, where would you say they could begin?
There's lots of different places you can start. I think there's a really good book called Abolition, Feminism Now, and it's by Angela Davis, and others, and that is a nice accessible text. It's all about some of these problems with mainstream feminism that I've kind of pointed out, but also it's about how we deal with them. So I think that would be a really nice place to start for people that are interested.
We've covered a lot of complex thoughts and topics during this episode, and as you've been talking, I've been writing a lot of things down on my pad. And I'm just going to try and summarise what we've gone through. And I think the first thing is that sexual violence isn't just about individuals. It's a part of how the world is actually built, and built unfairly. That power and wealth is in the hands of a few people and they would really like to keep it that way. And sexual violence is used to control people and stop them from resisting the unfair systems such as capitalism. These systems particularly affect women and minority groups. And racial capitalism is the idea that the system of making money and gaining power has always depended upon racism. And controlling people in a sexual way isn't something just done by bad individuals, by monsters, but it's also deeply connected to how our world is set up. But more positively, we talked about if people can understand those connections and how it works, then they can start to change things. And maybe, whilst they're well-intentioned people, start movements like Me Too, or at least raise the movements in their social media. If they can see the connections with what they're doing, then actually it can actually create real change and action, and not just shouting about how everything's so wrong. Finally, would you recommend people visit Portishead?
No.
Wow, did you not want to leave any pause between that?
No. There's a reason why their music's so depressing, Paul.
It's not depressing, it's melodic. And
it's amazing. But
I don't know if you're like me, that sometimes it doesn't come up often, but if I do mention it, people go, oh, the band, they're brilliant. And they feel that Portishead's this sort of New York cool hip hop vibe to it.
No.
And how disappointed are people going to be when they actually go down to the lake grounds?
Yeah, and everybody's so bloody miserable. Yeah,
Yeah.
it should be twinned with Roswell.
Because I think Roswell is obviously very famous for one thing, really.
Yes.
And people go to it and go, oh, that's a bit disappointing because it's only got that one thing.
Definitely.
And they're going to be even more disappointed with Portishead because I don't think Jeff or anyone, Adrian, still lives there anymore.
No, don't go there. Go somewhere else.
Super. So we've talked about sexual capitalism, racial capitalism, and Portishead. There you go. I bet you've not had that in any interview before.
I haven't.
Alison, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope that was all right for you.
Thank you for having me. It was great.